Good morning. It's Thursday the 30th of July. So I thought today I might make a video about the pros and cons of converting an ex-ambulance into a motorhome or a mobile workshop or whatever people buy them and convert them into. Project Amber, CJ, has done a similar video about his experiences of converting Amber. It's very good. I've done a lot of videos about the conversion of this ambulance I'm sitting in now. Playlist project was. I also own another ambulance, an ex-PTS Volkswagen Crafter, and that's Project Thistle, and I've done various videos on that. I'm a semi-retired ex-electronics engineer. Did a 4-year apprenticeship with GEC Avionics, worked there for many years. My last employment was as a project manager in IT, so my experience is erring on the side of the electrical side of vehicles. Done a lot of work over the years on various vehicles, member of many motoring clubs. Decided to do a motorhome in the autumn of 2018 and started researching what were out there. Very quickly eliminated buying an already built motorhome, primarily on cost but also on build quality. I'm staggered at how badly put together £50,000 motorhomes are. I won't say more on that. I do odd pieces of work for owners of vehicles, always have done. Currently I'm working on maybe 2 to 4 ex-ambulances a year. Predominantly I do electrical work, I don't do installations, I'm not interested in gas, don't build furniture people, but I'm happy to help out with electrics. So over the past couple of years I've seen a lot of ex-ambulances, and I'll come into the pros and cons of that later on. As I mentioned just now, I own 2 ambulances. This one I'm sitting in, it's a 2010 V6 Sprinter with a WAS Type B modular box on a 5,000 kilogram chassis. My other ambulance is a Volkswagen Crafter. It was built by DHL as a patient transport service ambulance, i.e. PTS, and that's a panel van. The areas that I tend to be involved with is vehicle electrics. Ambulances from an electrical point of view can be broken down into 3 types. The earlier ambulances, pre-2004, maybe 2006-ish, would either have a bespoke electrical system in them or something called Carnation Phoenix. It's easily identifiable. I've done a video on the Phoenix system that I removed from an Iveco bodied ambulance a few weeks ago. The Phoenix system was a single large black box wired to the lights in the back of the vehicle, sockets. It controlled the split charging, and the Phoenix system was managed and operated by 2 or sometimes 3 control panels, typically a small control panel at the back of the van and 1 or 2 at the front of the van. The control panels are linked by Cat5 cables running a serial protocol called RS485. The Phoenix system is a little bit power hungry, draws about 1.2 to 1.3 amps per hour all the time it's turned on. It is a single point of failure in that if anything goes wrong with the large black box, nothing in the back of the vehicle will work. The normal ambulance circuit should remain functional, the normal vehicle circuit should remain functional, lights, horns, etc. like that. But I believe that all ex-ambulance systems are not really suitable for use during the conversion into a motorhome. The Carnation Phoenix system, as I said, it's a single point of failure. I worked in a van last week where the thing was failing basically. The lights would come on but wouldn't turn off, and it really needs to come out. The later systems are also made by the same manufacturers, Carnation, and that is called Genesis. The current incarnation that's on the market hails from about 2006. It's a modular system. It comprises a single ECU and multiple output modules, little grey boxes. Again, I've done videos on the Genesis system in this van as well. It too is a single point of failure. If the ECU fails or an individual module fails, you've lost whatever circuits that thing managed. If the ECU fails, you lose the whole system. It is also operated by control panels linked in the same way via Cat5 cable. Typically, the large control panel in the front of the van, an 18-way panel that previously operated the blue lights and the sirens, and also had a very useful display on it showing battery voltage and various other warning messages, that disappears. Very rarely you will find a second-hand ambulance with that panel still installed, but the rear panel is often left in. It's another system that's energy hungry. My system has 5 modules to it, and that would draw half an amp each per hour, 12 amps a day if I left it on fully on. That's not good in the winter. Same with the Phoenix system, it's just not good running it in the winter. It's not an efficient use of power. The beauty of the Genesis system is it has easier to read outputs. They're labelled well, they've got LEDs for each output. You can see what each circuit does and you can see if a circuit is on. The downside of both systems is for everything to work in the back of the van, either the engine has to be running with the ignition on, or you need to do some wiring changes to fake it basically. You've got to bear in mind that an ex-ambulance is designed to be running almost 24 hours a day. If it isn't running, it's parked up in the workshop, plugged into mains, keeping the batteries charged. The electrical systems in ambulances were never designed to run off-grid for hours and hours and hours, so they can be energy hungry. And my recommendation's always been, it needs to come out, and you rewire manually. You put in switches and you connect everything up via fuses. It's a lot of work to take it out, but it's good practice, especially if the system's been got at, vandalised during decommissioning or whatever. Right, next section. It's worth pointing out at this stage that a lot of people seem to buy ex-ambulances because they believe they're tax exempt. They're not. They're tax exempt when they are being used solely for the purposes of being an ambulance for conveyance of patients to and from a hospital. They are not tax exempt when they're being used as a private vehicle, as a camper van, workshop or whatever. It is tax evasion to drive an ambulance on the road which is still registered as an ambulance. And when I say registered, I'm talking about the section on the V5 called the taxation class. The taxation class on a V5, if it says ambulance, means the vehicle is VED exempt. In the first instance, that needs to be changed to PLG if the ambulance is under 3,500 kilograms, or PHGV if it's above 5,000 kilos. I don't have any time for tax evaders. So that wraps up V5. Don't be a tax evader, do the right thing, get the vehicle classified as PLG or PHGV. Everyone needs to contribute to the maintenance of the roads, whether we want to or not. Right, so let's talk about 2 different types of ambulance. There's 2 different types of ambulance: a modular box van like I'm sitting in now, or a panel van conversion. I'll say straight away, if I knew today what I know now, did I say that right? If I knew then what I know now about panel vans, I wouldn't have bought one. The amount of work I've had to do on Thistle, my crafter, to get it to an acceptable state, my version of acceptable state, before I started converting it into a camper van, was excessive. And I'll cover that off later on. Whereas the modular box van I'm sitting in now, much better prospect. You've got a much better platform to convert, but the downside is you need the right license to drive it. So, pros and cons of either a PTS panel van or an ex-A&E panel van. Start with the pros. If you buy sensibly, they're cheap. Very, very cheap. These things go for a few £100 at auction. By the time they get through the trade, and if you're looking at traders, you could be paying 10 times what the thing's gone through at auction. Maybe not 10 times, but you can be paying a lot. At least double. They do come with lots of reusable bits, and the emphasis is on reusable. If you're really lucky, and this is an exception, but if you're really lucky, the thing will be well enough built and well enough insulated that you can convert it as is. I've had a lot of vehicles here over the past couple of years. I've only seen one that I thought was adequate as a potential camper van without gutting it to deal with the insulation, and that was an ex-St John's, that was an ex-St John's Renault Master dating from about 2002. They do come up. It may be that the St John's Ambulance Service get their vehicles built to a higher standard, because when you think about it, most of these St John's ambulances are parked up at the vents with volunteers sitting in them 24/7, sticking the odd bandage on people. So the vehicle needs to be a pleasant place to be. But certainly I had a wonderful little St John's ambulance here a few months ago, only 21,000 miles on the clock, which is extraordinary for a 2002 vehicle. I liked it, and it did appear, at least in the walls, to have a reasonable amount of insulation. There were some problems in the ceiling. I can see that from water. You can see water trails where condensation forms, and there were a few problems in the ceiling, but it was pretty good. The furniture was very nice, but in general, irrespective of whether it's a PTS or a ex-A&E ambulance, I've done several videos on ambulance insulation, you're going to find they're not properly insulated. In fact, they're not insulated at all, in my opinion. What they've got is a few bits of insulation material lobbed in a few holes to act as soundproofing. It's a major problem. Everyone has to make their own judgment call on this, but in my view, if you're going to be spending thousands of pounds on an ambulance to convert into a camper van, why cut corners at the very thing that matters the most, the insulation, especially in the ceiling? It's not just heat loss, it's solar gain. You will cook in an uninsulated ambulance, and these are, in many cases, not well insulated at all. The other problem you'll get as an owner of a a Peugeot Boxer that came here found out the first night she slept in it, under my carport, the amount of condensation that formed in the ceiling actually caused it to start raining inside. She had water dripping out from the lights, and when we took the ceiling down, which is on one of my videos, you'll see why. There was bugger all effective insulation in it at all, and that was a Peugeot Boxer ex-A&E ambulance. So, to summarise on that, if you're lucky, you can convert it as is. You're potentially taking a risk if you don't do enough research to see what's behind the cladding. On the subject of cladding, my Crafter had 3mm plastic cladding all round. It all broke and it all ended up in the bin. The better built ambulances will have a thicker cladding, plastic cladding, that you can, if you're careful, remove and reuse. Again, the Peugeot I took apart, that did, and apart from one small crack in the ceiling plastic, which probably wasn't going to be reused, we were able to save the walls, and that's worth doing. This van I'm in at the moment, worth mentioning, this is an aluminium sandwich. Aluminium outer skin, PIR insulation, and then aluminium, can you see it behind me? I don't know. It's got aluminium walls. It's a good strong construction, and where there isn't reinforcements it's well insulated, but the aluminium skin on the interior of the van causes condensation. I wish in this van I'd actually added a little bit more insulation on all the walls and used an inert material or an insulated warm to the touch material actually on the walls. But I built this quickly. I've used it in the winter and I've learnt from my own mistakes. Anyway, coming back to panel vans. You get lots of bits in these vans that you can resell. If it hasn't been heavily decommissioned, or if it isn't absolutely worn out beyond belief, say the Peugeot I had here had 540,000 miles on the clock, everything in it was buggered, I wouldn't have bought it. But you get lots of bits you can sell on, seats, stretchers sometimes, parts that can be resold. You also get lots of parts you can reuse. Even if you have to gut the entire vehicle, the cabinetry and furniture can be reused. I've reused everything in this vehicle. All the original cabinets I've modified and chopped up and used for various things, or kept as is. They come with heating, if it's working. They come with, what else we got here? Lots of windows. They will have roof vents. Most of them have rear air conditioning. They've got obviously plenty of lighting and electrical 12-volt sockets everywhere. Some will have an inverter. Every single one will have some kind of split charge, well, actually wrong. Some of the Masters, Renault Masters, PTSs don't. They just run off the single chassis battery. Most would have a separate battery circuit and some kind of split charging and multiple batteries. The batteries may well be knackered. The batteries don't last very long because these vehicles really do work hard. It's worth bearing in mind that all ambulances go through some level of decommissioning. That's important. The level of decommissioning means it may just be the blue lights may have been removed, nothing else, right through to the fact it's been absolutely vandalised. If you watch any of the Womble's videos, you'll see what Brightwells do. They damage the paintwork, they go at it with cutters, they rip all the light fittings out. There's nothing virtually left in the vehicle that is much use, unless it's old and worn out, and the assumption is that things like the heaters could well be old and worn out. So never assume all the parts will work, and also, as an element of safety, don't go powering things up without doing electrical checks. There could well be live cables left all over the place that will just short out. You've got the potential of fire, electrical fires. Certainly be very, very careful with main systems. A lot of ambulances wire for 110 volts. They were charged on a three-phase system in the depot at 110 volts. They've got yellow connectors on the outside. That's an obvious telltale. But a lot of 110 volt ambulances I have found don't come with any kind of mains breakers inside the vehicle or isolation or fusing. It's normally wired straight through to the battery charge or whatever. That's not safe. Don't go sticking 230 volts into something without doing a full electrical check via an electrician if you don't have the competence. Make sure everything through the entire circuit, starting with the cabling, the connector, the routing of the cabling, through to the consumer unit. You really need an RCD and ideally a 6 amp breaker for the battery charger, maybe a 16 amp breaker if it's feeding power sockets in the vehicle. Double check that anything in the circuit is rated at 230 volts, not 110. This van that I'm sitting in now was fine. Everything was okay at 230 volts once I changed the yellow connector and the cabling, except it had a 110 volt relay, and that relay operated whenever the mains were connected to tell Genesis that the mains were connected. If I hadn't checked for that, that relay would have gone up in smoke. But double check everything. If you're not sure what you're doing with mains, don't do it. Go to an electrician. Not an auto electrician. You don't need to go to anybody. You don't need an expert. You just need a good household domestic electrician that can do a straightforward safety check. The other thing to check for is earth bonding. Often there's no earth bonding at 110 volts, and realistically mains, 230 volt mains, things should be properly earth bonded. Certainly the consumer unit and the battery charger, but other things as well. If you're going to have a main socket in proximity to a stainless steel sink, for example, that sink should be earth bonded. It's just safety, don't cut corners. So, in summary of the pros, a PVC makes a good base vehicle, providing you're willing to do the work. Either because you've got to gut the thing to actually insulate it properly, or you're willing to accept that you're making a big compromise. One of the issues or one of the downsides with, or some of the downsides with a panel van, the first obvious one is the dreaded unwinch tracks. That applies to the modular ambulance as well. If the bolts are rusted up, they are picked to remove, but remove them you really should. The flooring in most ambulances is just a sheet of plywood, no insulation. Ambulances are disgusting filthy things. They're washed out regularly at the back, but water gets everywhere. You'll often find the floors have got rusting. My crafter floor had some very strange paint lifting and rust spots in it. If you don't unbolt all those unwinch tracks and take them out, you can't get the floor up, and you can't treat the floor and clear up all the mess and sick and all the other stuff that's got under there. The other thing is, if you don't take the floor up, you can't insulate it. They're not insulated. The unwinch tracks themselves, dirty great lumps of aluminium bolted through to the chassis of the vehicle. They are enormous cold bridges. In the winter, they will get really wet. I'm talking about seriously, but you'll actually get puddles forming in them from the condensation. So the unwinch tracks are absolutely worth taking out unless you intend to reuse them. I've removed everything in this van. In the crafter, I'm reusing short length of it to bolt a seat to. But I have lifted the floor, it's insulated, and the tracks itself, the parts of the tracks that aren't being used, will be covered with something to try and reduce the condensation, but they still get a little bit of condensation on them. As I mentioned earlier, in my view, most panel vans have totally adequate insulation. They've also got the Achilles heel. Windows are nice, but too much glass creates a greenhouse. Most of the windows in a panel van, especially a PTS, you need to think about what you're going to do about them. They're normally blacked out with tints. Oh, pause. Airplane. The windows are blacked out with tints. That's great for people not being able to see in. But as you can probably tell from this fan I'm sitting now, this has got permanently tinted glass, and it's very dark. It's black from the outside. It makes the outside look very dark as well. So you can probably just see there daylight, but through there, both windows, you can't see a thing through it. It's not such a big problem on a nice sunny day like today, but what we have learnt sitting in this van in the winter on an overcast day is it's really dark inside, really dark. The perception is that it's gloomy and miserable outside. You open the sliding door and blimey, you know, it's bright. It's not a nice, pleasant experience in the winter. So in my Crafter, it had tinted film on the glass, and I've removed that, and the difference is staggering. It's going to be a much more winter-friendly vehicle, and with proper blinds and heat shades and things, it's also going to be perfectly functional in the summer, because obviously I want to reduce the solar gain. But I will be reducing the size of the glass in the Crafter because I'll be using standard caravan blinds. But it's just worth thinking about. With a PTS ambulance, it's almost a minibus. You can have a lot of glass. If you don't do something about it, that glass also suffers from a great deal of condensation. These windows are secondary double glazed, and there's a blind in between. These windows are brilliant. You get very little condensation on them. You've got the blinds. If I could get the black tint off the glass on the other side of this blind, I'd be a happy bunny, because that's the only thing I don't like about these windows in this van. In the Crafter, I will be doing something similar. I'm going to try and replicate this. I won't be able to do the Venetian blinds, obviously, but I'm going to try and create a double glazed surface using secondary double glazing in the Crafter, because this is a damn good idea. It's very nice. Electrics. All ambulances. The electrics are overly complicated. They're not in their current configuration in any way suitable for use as a mobile home, as a camper van. It's what I specialise in. I take out systems out of these things regularly. If you do decide to use it as is, you've still got to rewire some circuits. You don't want everything running through a system that decides to power itself down every 5 minutes, which is what Genesis and Phoenix do. You also don't want to be leaving these systems on 24/7. You want to be able to put an isolation switch in. Most ambulances have an isolation button, if not fit an isolation switch, because you do need to be able to turn the power off to these systems, especially when the vehicle's parked up. My recommendation is really, even if you're going to use the existing panel in the van, try to find some way to rewire at least the lights so you can turn them on and off independent of the vehicle control systems. Most ambulances have done high mileage. I was lucky with the Crafter. It's only done 86,000 miles. It's extraordinary. The vehicle's in very good condition, but I paid too much for it, way too much for it, especially having had to gut it and throw most of the interior away. But they are very high mileage. If it's a PTS, service history is going to be variable. As I say, my Crafter's only done 86,000 miles, but they didn't change the cam belt when it was due, as far as I could tell. I guess they maintained that on a shoestring because it was run as a private ambulance for profit. The ambulance I'm sitting in now, Yorkshire Ambulance Service, I've got a full service history for it. It was done almost every 10 weeks or so. It's done 315,000 miles. You wouldn't think it. Drives perfectly. Would it go bang one day? Probably. Would it be down to the mileage? Maybe. But the reality is it was well looked after, and I can't grumble about that. One of the common problems with ex-ambulances is external bodywork damage. These things, just the nature of how they're used, get damaged. There was a big scrape in the side of this van. The Crafter's clearly had some paint on it because I think it's had a rear end shunt. When you're reviewing and considering buying a vehicle like this, don't just look at all the toys and all the gadgets, make sure the door's shut. The rear hinge on the back of this van has seen better days. I don't use the big door because the hinge is faulty, and it's not easy to change. The Peugeot Boxer I had here had clearly been in several accidents. There was a big dent in the side of the sill, and there was some damage to the rear doors, to the point where the rear doors didn't shut properly and you could see daylight through the door sills, and the sliding door didn't shut properly, you could see daylight underneath where the sill was caved in. That's a lot of expensive body repair work on a vehicle that isn't worth it. But you often see that on panel vans, body damage. Worth checking. I've mentioned the unwinch tracks. I think you should take them out because I think the floor needs a degree of insulation. When you do take them out, you've got a lot of holes underneath the vehicle to plug, and make sure you do plug them. I've got all mine sealed with Sikflex type substance. You don't need a world map or anything like that. They're not going to cause structural problems, but do plug them up, because you go through a deep puddle or a ford and the first thing you're going to find out is you've got a submarine. Well, maybe not a submarine, you've got thick full of water. The cabs. This is an ambulance. It had ambulance related electronics in the cab. Screens, radios and so on and so forth. The cabs get hacked to pieces. The damage in many isn't too bad, but if you look at the difference between an O&H conversion of a Fiat Ducato and the Wilk conversion of Fiat Ducato, the Wilk has been done in a much more sympathetic way. They haven't destroyed the air vents. There are fewer bits of plastic chopped up. The O&H conversion, I wouldn't touch an O&H conversion again with a barge pole. They do the worst job of the lot, and you end up with a really messed up dashboard. Cabs in ambulances don't seem to be cleaned, ever. They do clean the part I'm sitting in now, regularly, but the front cab, that is somebody's working environment, it's their office. You think of the mileage these things do. People are virtually living in these things 24/7. They're eating food, they're drinking drinks. Drinks get spilt, food gets dropped. Typically, get the mats out, get the seats out, clean. They are disgusting places up front, and there's often all sorts of disgusting stuff in there. I've found fossilised fruit, I've found jelly babies, growing fur. It's extraordinary what you find. The seats as well, get them steam cleaned. If they're not worn out, the cushions could easily have collapsed because of the mileage. But they're going to be covered in all sorts of unpleasant stuff. There's clearly signs of blood on the seats in my Crafter, and I should have those redone. Same with the seatbelt. The seatbelt webbing, the seatbelts in this van are orange, the seatbelts in the Crafter are red. When I bought both these ambulances, they were brown. With a bit of graft, you can get the seatbelt webbing nice and clean. It's worth doing because you're handling some pretty unpleasant substances. Same thing around the step area. If you can get the step up at some point in time, the plastic cover the step, clean it out, you'll find syringes, plasters, junk, you know. It's not nice stuff to be dealing with, and you don't want to have any accidents, so the vehicles do need thoroughly cleaning, especially the cab area. Mats in the cab. They're normally chopped up and butchered because they've mounted central consoles between the seats, etc, etc, etc. You're looking probably at binning them, or at least trying to find something to replace them with. These are sculpted mats. Be very careful if the mats provide protection for cabling. It's no good just taking it out and sticking a bit of underlay in there and some carpet. They actually do a function as well as a bit of soundproofing. So it may well be you've got to look at the price of replacement mats if they're that worn out. The Fiat Ducato is ridiculous. There are holes in the metal of the floor where people's heels go. Crazy idea. They cover it up with a bit of tape. It's an access hole to some, I think it's a suspension mount. But it's exactly where your heels are. The mats wear through right there. Crazy. So most ex-ambulances you'll see have got a large aluminium plate screwed down where people's feet go, simply to try and reduce the wear on the mats. I've mentioned seats and belts. I've mentioned excess glass. Try not to sound too negative, but this stuff isn't available, and people go out buying ambulances and find out the hard way afterwards, like I did. I bought my Crafter, believed the salesman, or I believed the concept that they were well insulated. I don't think the particular salesman I bought my Crafter from claimed it, but a lot of salesmen will tell you these are ideal campers, they're well insulated. It's bollocks, they're not. Never believe them. Right, modular vans. Most of them are better insulated, but not all. This that I'm sitting in now was converted by a German company called Was, that's why I call it Project Was. It's built like a superior modern caravan. If you look at the construction of modern caravans now, they're aluminium on this side, they've got a PIR insulation, they've got a timber framework, normally steel, crazy in this day and age, they're still using timber, and then something on the inside, plywood or maybe plastic or aluminium. These are built the same way with a subtle difference. They have a metal skeleton and they are often rollover tested. They're very, very strong. Excellent construction. The only downside with this particular van I'm sitting in, as I mentioned earlier on, is it's got aluminium skin on the inside which does attract condensation, and I personally think the insulation, although adequate as an ambulance, isn't quite enough for use as a camper van. It's only about 30mm thick, it's not enough. If I was to gut and do this vehicle again, there will be 25mm battens on all the walls and 25mm of PIR insulation between those battens and plastic or timber cladding on the inside of the vehicle to reduce the actual condensation. I get particularly bad condensation in my overhead lockers at the front because that's a very cold, you know, you're moving through the air, that's a cold point, and they aren't as well ventilated as it could be. And the other areas I get massive condensation in this van are the door frames. The door frames are aluminium. Obviously you've got the actual framework, it's an aluminium extrusion. That's a cold bridge, and the door frames get very, very wet, and I think it would be very difficult to do very much about those. Put some kind of external insulation on them, cork or closed cell foam, but you've got to ensure that you're not going to get something that gets soaking wet when the doors open when it's raining and stuff like that. But with hindsight, I would have insulated this differently. I built this van in a hurry, well, not a hurry, but I built this van as something to use while I was concentrating on the crafter. The older style box ambulances, like the, I think it might have been a McNeely body that I had here last week, far more insulation, something like 60mm in the ceiling, and I drilled 20 holes in the roof of that one while I was fitting solar panels and building a framework for a deck on it, and I didn't find a single area where there was a hole. Very nice. It did have some gaps where the blue lights and scene lights were on the outside where you could clearly see there wasn't insulation, but in general the much older bodies, some of them, seem to be better insulated. The doors are thicker, they put a bit more thought into the interior materials which are plastics, so you haven't got the same sort of problems. Well worth shopping around. Typically you get double glazing in these vehicles. Typically the windows are smaller, so you've got less solar gain, but as I mentioned earlier on, it can be a problem from a light, you know, gloomy perspective on the inside. The best thing about modular ambulance, the fact it's a square box, you've got square sides, it's much easier to build furniture and you've got a lot more space. They're typically about 2 metres wide, you can have a full width bed and stretch out. As I mentioned about the construction, this particular type of vehicle, I'm not saying they're all like it, but this one is rollover tested. I wouldn't like to be in an accident in one of these, but in theory, if everything's properly secured, and that's something else that applies to modular ambulances and caravan conversions, you'll notice that the furniture, or the cabinets, they're not only just bolted in to the van, they are glued in as well with a Sikaflex type product. These cabinets in these vehicles are very well secured. One of the things I notice on a lot of the DIY forums building vans is how shoddy the fixings are. Some people use those awful little plastic joining clips. They're not going to survive anything in an accident. You have to think, what if? It's common sense. So when I'm working on and building my own vans, I'm using the same techniques that I've learned from these ambulances. Bolt the damn things in and glue them in. The Sikaflex is extraordinary. If you watch my video on taking the overhead lockers out of Thistle, it was a 50kg cabinet, all the bolts were out, and it wasn't until I put the standing knife through probably the last 2 or 3 feet of Sikaflex that the thing actually came off the wall. It's worth doing. The chassis on a modular ambulance is a commercial chassis, 4 or 5 ton chassis. You've got a very strong vehicle. Those chassis are good for 500,000 miles. The chassis will outlast the vehicle probably. The engine may fail, may need replacing, and the bodywork may get manky and horrible, but the chassis are pretty good. You know, you haven't got a lot of work to do on a chassis. Most box ambulances are XA&E, so they are going to have been well serviced. Unlike, as I say, some PTSs maintained for a profit, service history is a bit checkered. Many do go through new engines. You often find that if you get hold of the service history, it may well have had a new engine at 200,000 miles or whatever. They're not changed as a matter of course, obviously something may have happened to it. There was a bunch of Sprinters a few years ago that the engines caught fire. All of them were changed, so they all had nice new engines in them. Modular box ambulance normally has good external storage. I've got a cupboard behind me with an external cupboard. It's where the gas locker are. We keep our chairs and tables in it. I've also got a really big box under the van that the batteries are in, and there's room in the box in this van for, I could probably get 5 batteries in there. I've got 2 in there at the moment. It came with 4. I probably could get 5 in there. They'll often have other cupboards, so I've only got 1 external cupboard and the battery locker. The van that I had here last week had 2 main lockers. One used to have the spinal board and the other one was for access to the gas tanks. Used properly, they're very handy, you know. And the last thing is, on a lot of the modular vans you may well have a retarder underneath, which is an electrical braking device. I've done a video on the work I did in the retarder here. If it's there and you're looking at buying one, check it. It's a very useful thing to have, especially when you're going down the hill and you've got brake fade. So cons now for a modular ambulance. Most of them weigh over 3,500 kilograms. Most people may not have a driving licence before 1997, therefore you won't automatically have the C1 status on your licence, therefore you can't drive a vehicle over 3,500 kilos. My advice, don't even think about buying one thinking you can downplate it to 3,500 kilos. I know a few people have maybe managed to get away with it, but I can almost guarantee you, once they're loaded up with kids, water, dogs, food, those vans aren't under 3.5 kilos, and the fines are excessive. It ain't worth it, even if you can get it downplated. And it's a tricky one. Maybe the modular box bodied ambulance is based with a fiberglass body. Maybe they're a bit lighter. I don't know, but certainly most modular bodies, they've got an aluminium skeleton. As I said, either later builds like this, where the insulation is a skin, a sandwich rather, of aluminium, PIR and aluminium, or where the skeleton has got an aluminium outer, and then the insulation, large blocks of an insulation material, you know, rock wool or whatever, has been put in between the skeleton and then the skin attached separately, and ideally that might be plastic. The earlier box body vehicles seem to be built like that. I had the Iveco Wilka body ambulance I had here a few weeks ago. It's built just like that. It had a lot of gaps in the insulation, but once the cladding's down on the inside you can actually do a lot about that. But they're heavy vehicles. Not worth, in my opinion, even buying one and thinking you can get it under 3,500 kilos. Far better to pay the money and get the C1 on your licence, which stays in place until you're 70 years old. The electronics and electrical systems in box bodied ambulances, because of their nature, typically more complex. Same systems, Phoenix and Genesis, but there's a lot more going on and there's a lot more to take out. What you will find in any ambulance is lots of holes in the inside. Even if you're planning to keep the interior intact, there's lots and lots of holes. You either find something to cover them up and fill them with, or you live with them. I'm looking right now where my cooker is, and there's umpteen bolt holes from where I think the life support pack went. We've used a lot of the holes in the vehicle for that and other things, and I'm about to fit a controller in for the extractor fan in the bathroom, making use of a hole up there that to this day I don't know what it was for, but I'm going to make use of the hole. During the decommissioning, as I said earlier on, the electrics do get vandalised, the light clusters get destroyed, the blue lights go missing, you end up with lots of external holes to deal with. Well, what they don't do is take the lift off. That's the one thing it would be nice if they did take off, but no, because obviously the thing's worthless, it's worn out, it's heavy, and they leave them on. So you'll inherit a vehicle with a lift. My suggestion, avoid like the plague ambulances where the lift is part of the back door. You've got a lot of work to reconstruct a door or close off that back end. So try very hard to get something with a separate lift, and then just enjoy many happy hours of undoing rusty bolts, playing with trolley jacks and getting the stupid thing off. The scrap value of the metal, especially the aluminium, is probably worth more than you'll get for the entire lift on eBay. So if you've got the time to separate the aluminium from the steel, you can get good money for it. But the lifts are entertaining. There's two variations, an external lift and internal lift. The Crafter, I've done a video on it, the Crafter had an internal lift. It was actually fantastic for carrying motorbikes in, and that van would have made a brilliant motorbike transporter. This van had an external lift. The control unit had been robbed out, so I couldn't play with it other than manually operate it via the jack that comes with them. But I took it off and sold it on. Now, it's a personal choice. I prefer the modular ambulances. As I said at the beginning of this, if I'd known what I do today, I wouldn't have bought the panel van, I would have just bought one of these. What I have learned from this van is, if I were to do it again in this particular vehicle, I would increase the insulation it's got in it. And I'll probably do something about these windows. I'll probably actually take them out and replace them with Overlander style windows that open. That's another thing, forgot to mention. Ventilation. In this van, all I've got is the skylight and the extractor fan. None of the windows in the back open. It's awful. There's just not enough ventilation, and of course that leads to more condensation. So when you're looking at a modular box van, or even a panel van, you want at least one window that opens. It makes all the difference. There's some purchasing options when you're buying an ambulance worth thinking about. The most common source is to go to one of the auction houses or eBay. You'll often find traders advertising ambulances for sale that they've bought directly from auction. The markup's normally about 100%. Some of the less honest traders will tell you all sorts of lies about them being well insulated. As I said, in my opinion they're not. Don't believe what the traders say. Go and look at the vehicle, check all the bits work. Does it represent good value money? Bell just went, nearly dinner time. You'll find a lot of people that have bought ambulances have bitten off more than they can chew, so you'll often find partial conversions for sale on eBay. You can go direct to auction. There are two main auction houses in the UK that seem to sell ambulances. One is Brightwell's in Herefordshire, the other one is in Merthyr Tydfil. Some people like them, some people don't. I've watched Womble's channel, he does actually publicise the auctions. The biggest thing I have with these auction houses is these vehicles come in direct from the NHS. They're intact when they arrive, normally intact when they arrive. The auction houses provide a service to the NHS which involves decommissioning the vehicle and selling it on and sharing some of the profits. The auction houses vandalise them. Frankly, that's the only way to describe it. The Battenberg stickering is removed in such an aggressive way it damages the paint, and the people just go at them with cable cutters. You end up with a vehicle that's pretty much in need of a lot of TLC. It's not my term, not my definition of decommissioning, but the vehicles are very, very cheap, and I bet the NHS gets very little money by the time the auction house has taken its fee off for doing the decommissioning. As I said, traders buy from there, and then you can buy exactly the same vehicle from a trader, just 2 or 3 times the price. The best source is to go to an events company. There are a couple of Facebook groups where event companies sell second, third use fit ambulances that they've bought initially from an ambulance service and they've used it as an ambulance. The best, as I say, the best source is probably from them because you'll get an intact entire vehicle. A lot of sellers will say they've got to take the blue lights off, etc, etc. I don't believe it's really necessary. There's no legal obligation to do it, and I'm quite sure that if I was to buy another ambulance again and I was going to go to a Benz company, I would simply have it delivered because I can't drive the thing because I can't tax it yet. Legally I can't drive a vehicle without as a taxivator, or rather I won't drive it as a taxivator. So this ambulance and my previous ambulance, my other ambulance I had delivered. It was actually cheaper to have it delivered than insure it, and cheaper than the fuel. On that basis, just get the damn thing delivered. Blue lights intact, sirens intact, and everything else. Decommission it yourself. You can carefully unscrew things a lot better than some oik with a pair of cutters and a crowbar can. It's worth thinking about. Because the amount of work you've got to do to convert an ambulance, extra work. Treat it as a longer term project. If you want to do something in a hurry, go out and buy a standard panel van and just convert it. There's lots and lots of excellent videos on YouTube about how to convert panel vans. Greg Vergo's probably the best. I don't think it's really worth watching anything else. But if you buy an ambulance and you want to do it properly, and I'm talking about properly, so it's actually usable 25/7, 365 days a year, it's got to be well insulated. If you've gone out and bought a van and you discover it's not well insulated, bite the bullet, gut the thing, do it properly. Anyway, I think I've covered off all the points I wrote down on my bit of paper here. Thanks for watching. Hopefully it's not been too boring, and maybe it may help a few people from making an expensive or time-consuming mistake. These are worth doing, but if it's worth doing, it's worth doing right. That's it. Thanks for watching.